4 days ago, Spain lifted the World Cup trophy under the lights at MetLife Stadium, and for most fans that felt like the end of the story. It wasn't. While the confetti was still being swept off the pitch, FIFA quietly confirmed a number that might end up being bigger than the football itself. More than $13 billion. That's the revenue FIFA says it generated across this 4-year World Cup cycle, and it makes 2026 the richest era the sport has ever seen. This isn't a leaked rumor or an exaggerated headline. It's the organization's own confirmed figures, and they've already blown past what FIFA originally set out to earn when this cycle began. So how did football's governing body pull in that kind of money? And why is that exact success now fueling talk of an even bigger and far more controversial World Cup in 2030? Is bigger always better when it comes to the World Cup? Or is FIFA starting to chase revenue at the expense of the game itself? That's the question a lot of people inside football are suddenly asking out loud. So what's really happening here? Let's start with what actually happened this summer. The 2026 World Cup was the first edition of the tournament to feature 48 teams, up from the 32 we'd all gotten used to for decades. It was co-hosted across 3 countries for the first time in World Cup history: the United States, Mexico, and Canada. 16 host cities, 104 matches, and a tournament that stretched across 6 weeks from mid-June into mid-July. The United States carried most of the load, hosting the majority of matches across 11 cities. Mexico staged games in 3 cities, and Canada hosted men's World Cup matches on home soil for the very first time in its history. It all wrapped up on July 19th, when Spain beat Argentina 1-0 after extra time, with Ferran Torres scoring the winner in front of a packed house in New Jersey. But behind the football, FIFA had been running its own tournament, a financial one. Heading into this 4-year cycle, the organization had set itself a target of around $11 billion in revenue. It didn't just hit that number, it blew past it, with confirmed figures now landing close to $13 billion for the full cycle, and the World Cup tournament itself responsible for roughly $9 billion of that on its own. To put that in perspective, the Qatar cycle that ended back in 2022 brought in around $7.5 billion. That means this cycle grew revenue by somewhere close to 70% in just 4 years. Some of that growth came from an obvious source. 48 teams instead of 32 means more matches, more broadcast windows, and more tickets to sell. But part of it also came from something newer, the 2025 Club World Cup, a tournament that wasn't even part of FIFA's original budget for this cycle. That tournament alone is reported to have added roughly $2 billion that FIFA wasn't originally counting on, which helps explain why the final number climbed so far past the initial target. Before we get into where that money actually came from, if you're into these kinds of football business breakdowns, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Here's where things get interesting. When you break down that $13 billion, 3 revenue streams stand out, and they tell you a lot about how FIFA actually approaches the World Cup these days. Broadcast rights remain the single biggest piece of the pie. Reports suggest that stream grew from just over $3 billion in the last cycle to more than $4 billion this time around, driven largely by the value of broadcasting matches into the massive North American market. Sponsorship is the second major pillar, and it grew significantly too. Major global brands, alongside a fresh wave of American sponsors, expanded their deals around the tournament, with some reports putting that growth above 50% compared to the last cycle. Then there's ticketing and hospitality, and this is where things get a little more uncomfortable. Reports indicate that revenue from tickets and hospitality packages nearly tripled compared to Qatar, jumping from under $1 billion to somewhere around $3 billion. Part of that jump makes sense on its own. Stadiums in the United States are enormous compared to what was available in Qatar, some built for the NFL and seating 70,000 to 80,000 fans, so there were simply more seats to sell in the first place. But some of that growth also came down to pricing strategy. Dynamic pricing, where ticket costs shift based on demand, along with FIFA's own resale marketplace, pushed prices for certain matches into territory that a lot of ordinary fans found genuinely hard to justify. Some supporter groups have publicly used strong language over this pricing, describing it as something close to a betrayal of the very fans who fill the stadiums and create the atmosphere the tournament is known for. That's a real tension FIFA is sitting with, even as the overall numbers look historic on paper. Think about it. FIFA is technically a non-profit organization, but it's now sitting on commercial numbers that would make plenty of publicly traded companies jealous. And it's not just the World Cup carrying that weight anymore. The newly created Club World Cup, staged in the United States during the summer of 2025, acted as a kind of dry run for a lot of what fans experienced this year, from the pricing strategies to the commercial partnerships involved. That tournament brought in sponsors from Gulf state-backed companies and other major global brands, essentially testing the commercial playbook FIFA would go on to lean on for the main event a year later. So when people ask how FIFA got this close to $13 billion, the honest answer is that it wasn't one single thing. It was bigger broadcast deals, bigger sponsorship packages, more expensive tickets, and an entirely new tournament stacked into the mix, all growing at the same time.
But that's only part of the story, because that same financial success is now the exact argument being used to push the World Cup even further. This matters because it's not the first time FIFA has expanded the World Cup to chase growth, but the scale of what's being discussed now is different from anything that's come before it. Go back far enough and the World Cup was a 16-team event. It grew to 24 teams in the early 80s, then to 32 from 1998 all the way through 2022. Each expansion brought in more countries, more matches, and more money along with it. The jump to 48 teams for 2026 was already the biggest single expansion in the tournament's history. Now, almost immediately after that experiment succeeded commercially, the conversation has shifted toward going even further, all the way to 64 teams for 2030. That idea isn't coming out of nowhere. FIFA President Gianni Infantino confirmed back on July 12th, while the 2026 tournament was still underway, that the organization would formally discuss expanding to 64 teams once this World Cup had wrapped up. Then, CONMEBOL President Alejandro Dominguez, who also serves as a FIFA Vice President, went further, posting on social media that the 2030 tournament would be a 64-team event, framing it as something closer to a done deal than an open discussion. It's worth being clear here. FIFA itself hasn't officially confirmed that number. What we actually have is a confirmed conversation, a public push from CONMEBOL, and a FIFA president who's openly receptive to the idea, but no final decision has been made yet. The timing and framing matter too. The 2030 World Cup is already unusual, co-hosted primarily by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, with Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay each hosting a single centenary match to mark 100 years since the very first World Cup was played in Uruguay back in 1930. Supporters of a 64-team format argue that a tournament built around celebrating a full century of the World Cup deserves to be historic in scale too, opening the door to more countries that rarely, if ever, get a real chance to qualify. The bigger issue is what that would actually mean structurally. A 64-team World Cup would likely mean 16 groups of 4 teams instead of the current format, and a jump to somewhere around 128 matches, roughly double what a traditional 32-team tournament would produce. That's not a small tweak. That's closing in on doubling the entire footprint of the tournament in less than a decade, going from 32 teams before 2026 to 48 this year to a possible 64 just 4 years later. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about where football is actually heading, so do me a favor and tap subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of breakdown coming. But there's another angle to all of this, and it's the one generating the most pushback right now. The players and the people who actually run the club game day to day. FIFPro, the Global Players Union, has already raised concerns, projecting that top international players could end up playing somewhere between 70 and 83 matches across club and country in a single year if the calendar keeps expanding like this. That's an enormous physical load on the athletes fans actually pay to watch, and it's part of a broader complaint that's been building for years about how packed the football calendar has become for the players at the very top of the sport. Confederation leaders aren't fully on board either. UEFA's president has publicly criticized the 64-team idea, arguing it would damage both the tournament itself and the qualifying process that feeds into it. CONCACAF's president has raised similar concerns about the impact on the wider football ecosystem from national teams down to domestic leagues. Even league officials have weighed in. The head of Spain's top domestic league didn't hold back, describing the expansion push as irresponsible and warning it could hurt an industry that supports far more jobs and far more of the football calendar than the World Cup alone ever will. For fans, the impact cuts a slightly different way. A bigger tournament could mean more countries to cheer for and easier access for smaller footballing nations, which is genuinely exciting for a lot of people watching around the world. But it also raises real questions about qualifying becoming less competitive, group stages losing some of their intensity, and the kind of ticket pricing fans just experienced in 2026 potentially stretching even further across an even bigger event. Would this affect your excitement for a future World Cup, or does a bigger tournament actually make you more interested in following it? So where does this actually go from here? Right now, the honest answer is that nothing's locked in. FIFA has just closed out its most profitable 4-year cycle ever, pulling in more than $13 billion off the back of a record-breaking 48-team World Cup that the whole world just watched Spain win. That success is now the exact argument being used to push for an even bigger tournament in 2030, one that could grow all the way to 64 teams, even though nothing has been officially confirmed just yet. On one side, you've got a governing body and a confederation president pointing to record revenue and a century of history worth celebrating in a big way. On the other, you've got players' unions, confederation leaders, and league presidents warning that football might be getting stretched past what the calendar and the players can actually handle. Both sides genuinely have a point, and that tension probably isn't getting resolved anytime soon.